Today, I want to talk to you about emergency management plans and the requirements of the new Work Health and Safety Act and its subsidiary regulation in regard to emergency management on site. To contextualise this a little bit first though, all of the pieces of legislation talk about emergency management and the various requirements. However, today I want to focus specifically on the mines regulations that have recently come out and the detail that's in there around emergency management. So getting straight into it, all of the legislation requires that mine sites develop emergency plans. And Regulation 43 says that the mine operator has a duty to prepare, implement and maintain an emergency plan. So those are three very, very distinctly different duties. The preparation, obviously there's some considerations in there, the implementation, but very importantly is the maintenance of the emergency plan. And we'll talk about that in more detail as we go through. So very generally, the requirements are the plan should facilitate an effective response to any identified emergency. It should describe evacuation procedures, notification and communication to interested parties and stakeholders. It should talk about medical facilities that are required. And it should also talk, very importantly, about testing and evaluation of the performance of the emergency plans. It should also talk about training and instruction for people that are responsible for implementing the emergency plans. So during the development of the emergency plan, which is the first part of that process, regard must be given to the following aspects. These four elements really fit into two categories. First of all, the nature of the work carried out at the mine and the nature of the hazards at the mine. Now, when doing risk assessments on the mine, the hazards are identified and mitigation plans for potential emergencies need to be developed. And that's dependent on the work that the mine carries out and the hazards associated with those. The second part of that is the size and location of the mine and the number and composition of the workers and other people at the mine. The size and location of the mine is critical. Its location can in itself present hazards. For instance, if it's in a flood-prone area or bushfires are very prevalent, those sorts of things. So Division 5 in the regulations, emergency management, talks about the duty to prepare emergency management plan. And specifically Regulation 664 says that the plan must address all aspects of emergency response and that it should establish a system that enables all people at the mine to be promptly located. So effectively that's a muster system. So regardless of whether that's workers or visitors to the mine. It should provide for adequate rescue equipment, adequately trained personnel that can respond and implement the plan. It should talk about adequate patient transport. So that's not just patient transport on the mine, it's patient transport from the scene of any particular event to the point where they can receive comprehensive medical assistance. Importantly, the plan must be readily understood by people who use it. So having a huge, great document that's stored in offices, even though that may be accessible to people who are going to implement it, it's not really practical. And importantly, the emergency plan forms part of the mine safety management system, as do other subsidiary plans, for instance, ventilation plans, asbestos management plans, and so forth. So continuing with Division 5, emergency management, there are two specific areas where this new legislation really focuses on. And the first of these is consultation in regard to preparation of the emergency management plan. So some very specific requirements are, first of all, the mine operator is required to consult with emergency services that may need to respond. And it goes further in that they need to develop the plan almost in consultation with the emergency services, which makes sense because the mine needs to know what is available and what emergency response services they need internally. They also need to consult with mine workers on any mine that participates in implementing the plan. What this means is that if the mine has a mutual aid agreement with another mine, that must be taken into account when developing the plan. Some things to consider in that regard: if there is a major widespread emergency, for instance a flood, a bushfire, any resources that the plan may talk about from another mine site might not be available because they might be looking after their own mine in that event. The third area that's specified is that the mine needs to consult with local government and regional local government in regard to any impact that the surrounding community and people outside of the mine may experience as a result of an emergency on the mine. For instance, if there's a processing plant on the mine and there is an uncontrolled release, what effect might that have on the surrounding community? And so consultation has to be had with local government in that regard. So as I mentioned before too, this goes further than just consulting with them. The mine operator must address any recommendation made by any of these stakeholders and include those in the plan. And that's in regard to the way the plan is tested, how frequently it's tested, and who's going to participate in that testing or exercising of the plan. Some other regulations that are really important in the general requirements of Division 5.2. Copies of the emergency plan to be kept and provided. The mine needs to keep a copy of the plan on the site, and it also needs to give a copy of the plan to DFIS. It also makes sense that any stakeholder who's going to be involved in implementing of the plan has access to at least a part of the plan that they are responsible for and understand how that fits into the bigger picture. Regulation 668 talks about resources for the emergency plan and that the mine operator must ensure that all resources that are specified or described in the plan are available. So this is not only equipment resources, it's also human resources. And it's important when designing plans, particularly in these days of COVID, that human resources that might be laid out in the plan are not always available. So it's important to make sure that human resources and equipment resources are available so that the plan can be implemented. There's also a requirement that all equipment resources are maintained in good working order and can be available at any time. So the next area that the new regulations really call out and focus on is testing of the emergency management plan. In fact, Regulation 669 specifies that the plan must be tested at least every 12 months. So that's a minimum requirement. And depending on turnover of people, changes to operations on site and the nature of the mining operation, it could be much more frequently than that. It also could be influenced by external factors as well too. For instance, changes in resources that are available externally and so forth. So in addition to this minimum requirement of having to exercise the plan or test the plan every 12 months, regard must be given to recommendations made by stakeholders during the plan's development. So any recommendations that are made by any of the stakeholders we've spoken of before must be included in that testing regime. The plan must also be tested after any significant revision of the plan, and the revision of the plan could be through changes to the business on the mine site. It could be changes to resources that are available and other things. And following on from that, Regulation 670 requires a review of the emergency management plan. And specifically, if any risk control measure on the mine site is changed, the emergency plan for the mine must be reviewed in regard to associated risk controls. So anything that's going to change on the mine site that could impede the effectiveness of the plan's implementation needs to be reviewed. So Regulation 670A talks about the training of workers. Workers must be trained in relation to their responsibilities to implement the emergency plan. So that ranges from workers who have nothing directly to do with implementing the plan, right up to the people who own and will manage any emergency event on site. And the regulation talks about before commencing work, particularly if they start work and their inability to participate in the implementation of a plan could impede its effectiveness, then they should be trained before they start work. And also after a significant revision of the emergency management plan. And we talked about that revision process before, but essentially any changes on site that drive that revision must be communicated to all workers, and workers should be trained where their duties in the implementation are altered. So the emergency management plan should also describe the management structure and the personnel arrangements on site in regard to how the plan is implemented. And as part of that, Regulation 670B talks about the site senior executive of a mine appointing a competent person to be a mine emergency worker in relation to a specific emergency or all emergencies. So this can mean that somebody can be specifically appointed to manage or coordinate an emergency, such as an incident controller, or it could refer to people in an ERT team who have specific responsibilities. So moving on from Division 5, in the regulations there is Schedule 22, which is matters to be included in the emergency management plan. So these are very, very specific areas that need to be addressed in your emergency management plan. So Schedule 22 specifies that the following areas need to be addressed. So site and hazard detail that we spoke of in the beginning. So the nature of the site, the size of the site, its location, and the hazards associated with the work that's undertaken there. It requires that the plan address the command structure and site personnel involved in the plan implementation, and importantly, how they interact with external stakeholders. Notifications and communications, so that's internal notifications in the event of an emergency, communications externally with other mine sites, for instance, in a mutual aid agreement, or emergency services that are assisting in the response. It needs to address the resources and equipment that are available and need to be available all the time. The procedures for responding to individually identified hazards and their associated emergencies or potential emergencies, and also training and competence. So essentially that describes the requirements under the new legislation for emergency management plans on site. The key areas that have changed, as I said, just to recap, are testing of the plans and communication and consultation with stakeholders, and how that communication and consultation needs to be built into the plans and specifically addressed. So that wraps up this presentation. Please stay in touch. On the screen are some additional resources that you can tap into to get further information from Demers. Thank you.